Hello, everybody. Patricia Calkins here again. So, separation may work best for you. Sometimes the form of acculturation that somebody takes is voluntarily chosen, and sometimes the form that is taken is forced upon the new immigrant. Barry had four preconditions that would determine the likelihood of which strategy might be pursued. The first is the level of acceptance by a society for the value of cultural diversity. If the society I am integrating into does not value cultural diversity, it will be harder for me to integrate into it. There also may be a level of prejudice. There may be attitudes among ethnocultural groups, my own ethnocultural group, other ethnocultural groups that are part of that society, that may affect the form of acculturation. And the extent of my identification with the larger society by individuals and by groups. So, what kind of identification do I have with the dominant culture? All of those things are going to affect the way that I acculturate. Some acculturations are not voluntary at all. So we're going to look at just a couple of historical examples. The US and Canada both began problems of forced assimilation of Native American children in the 1870s. The Native American children at a very young age were removed from their homes and sent to boarding schools where they would not have the influence of their traditional tribal cultures to help them grow up. The programs were unsuccessful, extremely unsuccessful. Um, and the children became alienated both from their native culture and from the new culture. So these children were marginalized. They had no way to choose their cultural norm. How do you think this affected the children and their families and their tribes? Obviously, many of these children grew up with trauma or with psychological issues, and these problems continued for decades. So, if we want to think about how it happened with the boarding school experience, so the Native Americans lost their connections to their culture, their traditions, and languages. So, if you look at the picture on the left, this is a picture from the Carlisle Indian School, which was in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. This was the best known of the residential Indian schools, but there were quite a few of these schools. The top picture and the bottom picture are the same group of students. The top picture is when these students arrived at the Carlisle School, and the bottom is when the children had been there at about 4 months. 4 months later. So you notice that one of the first things that happened was that the children were required to give up their native dress and instead were put in uniforms. Their hair was cut, which was a huge insult for the Native American children. They often lost their names, which had had particular cultural value to them, and they instead were given names that resonated with the dominant English-speaking culture. They suffered trauma not only from being separated from their families and their culture, but also because the conditions at the schools themselves were not nurturing for children. As you can see from the uniforms, they were run on the style of the military. Um, they often did not have good medical care, so many children died from tuberculosis and other diseases far away from their families. Um, and there was very strict discipline. When students were returned to their tribes years later, the tribes didn't recognize them anymore. They were seen with suspicion. The children who had been full members of that particular in group no longer spoke the language. They didn't understand the tribal traditions. They had no skills that were necessary for living within that culture. They represented that outside Western culture. And they had been tasked by the people at the Indian schools for driving the assimilation of those who were still in the Indian tribes. And their success was measured by how many Native Americans adopted the ways of the dominant culture. Um, Very few Native Americans ever adopted the ways of the dominant culture because these children came back to their tribes. And many of these children would leave the tribes again later and go back to the boarding schools. On the side of the tribes themselves, they lost an entire generation or two of their potential leaders, and their critical cultural cohesion was destroyed, which led to some of the generational suffering that has happened with Native Americans ever since then. There's another forced kind of assimilation, and this was a forced separation. So there are many, there were previously many more Chinatowns across America. The biggest Chinatown is in San Francisco, although there is a huge Chinatown in New York and in many other large cities. The Chinese were particularly discriminated against in U.S. history. um, they were denied entrance into the country specifically because they were Chinese. They were prohibited by law to testify in court. They couldn't own property. They couldn't vote. They couldn't have families join them. They couldn't marry non-Chinese. They couldn't work in any institutional agency. Um, they couldn't live in certain places. They couldn't have certain jobs. Um, so it was a very difficult thing to be Chinese in the United States in the 19th century. Um, the Chinese began to arrive in larger numbers in the 1850s, particularly in California, which was a time of the gold rush, and the Chinese were not wanted on the gold fields. So creating Chinese spaces that were separate from that mainstream was a survival strategy. Um, so they developed Chinatowns, which were like little islands in the middle of American culture, and had family connections and mutual associations that provided support for those who were already there and for those who were new to arrive. Um, these groups could also fight against discrimination that was becoming ever more prevalent in the legislation of the United States. So this is a picture of 19th century Chinatown. Uh, the ratio of men to women in Chinatown was 20 to 1 because most of the Chinese immigrants were male. Um, the atmosphere was bright and noisy and bustling. You could hear Cantonese dialects. You could see traditional Chinese costumes, Chinese food. It was a place where Chinese immigrants could feel safe. And it was in the security and solidarity of Chinatown in San Francisco and in other Chinatowns that the Chinese felt that they would be able to survive the racial and economic oppression. The Chinese Chinatown in San Francisco was destroyed in the San Francisco earthquake in 1906. But it was rebuilt after 1906 specifically to attract tourists. And so here you see a picture of current day Chinatown. Chinatown is today one of San Francisco's biggest tourist attractions. So there has been some more integration into the economic life of the city, but there is still this center of largely Chinese ethnicity. Just as an aside, the coronavirus that has arisen in Wuhan in this year, in the spring of 2020, has served to increase discrimination against Chinese Americans because of the fear that Chinese Americans may be carrying the coronavirus. So it could be true of a Chinese American whose family arrived in San Francisco in 1850 that they will be discriminated against for perhaps carrying the coronavirus. The Chinese minority and many other Asian minorities are easily identifiable within US culture and thus are more likely to become scapegoats in times of fear. There is a legacy of forced acculturation, and this is particularly at a time in cases of racism. In such cases, the immigrant group is denied equal status as a full member of the in group. So, although we are allowed to be here, we are simply not accepted. So it could be that a particular kind of acculturation could be forced upon me. Forced acculturation is, as I've said before, less successful than a voluntary form of acculturation, and the ramifications of that forced acculturation can continue for generations after the event, as we saw in the case of the Native American boarding schools. Forced acculturations are about conformity. We want people to conform to what we think a culture is. I find this a little strange in a society that says that it values individualism above all else. And yet we find calls today also for immigrants to conform to that ideal that we have about what an American is. Voluntary acculturations, thank goodness, are much more successful and they're also much more common. The way that people choose to acculturate is generally voluntary. And voluntary acculturations are especially successful if the dominant culture values diversity and if the dominant culture realizes that changes that are brought about by interactions with the newcomers in our midst are on the whole positive and are not negative. So that's a little bit more about immigration and acculturation, and I'll be talking to you soon. Bye.